These are the Beam Chronicles, with your host, MJ Dooney. Book 2, Compromise. Chapter 1, Cidney Kovorski.
Beam was always very public about its infrastructure, but it was the sort of thing that went unnoticed in the general populace. No random citizen is tracking the details of new programs and initiatives in the military or the police force, our most analogous counterparts, so why would he or she care about a new department, something called AVA, created roughly 5 years ago to handle the most challenging anomalies? And so it remained not clandestine or hidden, but nonetheless a buried mystery. Until the day Enzo Skelton broke Tyler Foon out of the dungeons, and my teammates and I fought them in the streets of the capital. After that, the secret was out. We were Beam's team of anomalies that caught other anomalies. Even if people did not know the name Ava immediately, in concept alone, we were instantaneous celebrities. Charlie Shade, Jackson Teague, and Cidney Kovorski were household names within a week of Flyphone. We would be in contention for the most unique trio of individuals in history, were someone to endeavor to award such an honor. The so-called anomalistic capacities contributed to this exceptionality, be it Charlie's grouping and sixing, Jackson's psychokinetic manipulation, or my strength and highly corrosive projectile body fluid, K-Pack. But I think what made us the most unprecedented was the combination of our incredible track record against opponents, our unparalleled celebrity that had developed therein, and the blatant fact that in spite of this fame and success, none of us cared for Beam's mission in the slightest. The devotion we did have in this war was simply a devotion to each other, and that was more than enough to keep us going. Today was the 2-year anniversary of Flyphone, and during these grossly eventful 2 years, that allegiance had become nearly unbreakable. Murphy once told me, being an old FBI veteran, that a day in combat was worth 10 times as much as a normal day for a relationship between any two individuals. So, by this metric, I had effectively spent 2 decades fighting alongside my brother Jackson and my sister Charlie. The safety of our little family was paramount to all of us, and in exchange for it, I would do anything, including becoming a figurehead for Beam's unjust cause. Or I suppose, more appropriately, a convenient distraction from it. Beneath the rug of our fame was swept every ethical problem Beam had ever faced. Public relations became a new department. To ensure our facade was robust, there were conventions and t-shirts, paparazzi, talk show appearances, endorsements. It was all an act, all a game for our tortured triumvirate. We were the self-loathing beloved, false heroes who were not permitted to describe themselves as such, prisoners who hid our chains as we smiled pleasantly, waved to the screaming masses, and violently enacted Howard Prophet's genocide to their sadistic delight. We were gladiators. We always won, but never wished to play. We were subjugated, coerced into being soldiers, but left to our own devices, I highly doubt any of us would have even supported the crusade. Surely, we would not have fought for it. In fact, subtract all of that coercion, and the 3 of us would likely instead represent Beam's strongest opposition to date. The competition for that title was not steep, however, and the coercion showed little sign of let up, so we were forced to merely hope for that one true hero to emerge and shine a light on Beam's darkness in the way we could not. Clifton Hodge. He was not the first to attempt stepping into that hero's role, but I think he got the closest. That was most likely why he was dead. Standing up to an organization as massive and potent as Beam was political suicide, beyond the fact that we were supported by a vast majority, government subsidized and sanctioned, and staffed with a well-trained elite set of specialized task forces. Beam was an economic juggernaut. Between the technological advances we had pinched off of busted anomalies, the nearly infinite energy production courtesy of my chloroplastic brother Phil, and the considerations and donations we received from the establishments we had protected over the years, Beam had the money to do just about anything. It has been said that money does not imply power, but Beam had a lot of money. And to overestimate Beam's influence would be nearly an impossibility. We were Big Oil, the Department of Defense, Silicon Valley, and more recently Hollywood, all rolled into one tiny murderous package. You would either have to be an idiot or a genius, probably a little of both, to poignantly and effectively protest everything Beam stood for. The first man I recall attempting to do so was only an idiot. A religious figure, Gino was his first name, I forgot the last, perhaps a telling statement about the longevity of his resistance movement. Gino argued from a platform of morality that the process of equalizing anomalies for any reason, much less one they cannot control, was ethically wrong. Gino's campaign would have possessed a much less flimsy foundation were he himself not such a poster child for depravity. The scouting department, notorious for their ability to uncover all manner of things that wished to remain covered, constructed a list of transgressions long enough to blackmail him into shutting his mouth. In this particular instance, I use the word transgressions as a euphemism for prostitutes, and the preacher was a loyal and frequent patron of his, transgressions. I found it all somewhat disconcerting, personally. His moral center was somewhat askew by traditional standards, but this fact did nothing to detract from the valid questions he raised on the nature of Beam. Charlie assured me that it was as simple as, people do not trust perverts. I mentioned that he was as well a clergyman, but this apparently only exacerbated the level to which he would be discredited were his friends of the night to be made public knowledge. After Gino, there were a few murmurs of dissent that Beam failed to suppress before they had reached semi-audible volume, but nothing as significant as the preacher until an up-and-coming representative out of Wyoming by the name of Eric Brady. Brady, somewhat in the same vein as Gino, spoke on the injustice of Beam's procedures, but specifically he concerned himself with the legality, the constitutional rights of anomalies as citizens of the United States, and the deprivation of due process. Brady himself was not without his own dirty laundry, a significantly less extensive hole than scouting had dug up on the preacher, but not entirely unimpressive considering how diligently politicians work to keep their noses clean. And while it would likely be enough to smear his good name, this was not the tactic utilized to douse his flame of objection. Jackson explained the difference in strategy between Eric Brady and the preacher to me thusly, and nobody would think twice about a crazy old minister out in the desert fading back into the shadows once his 15 minutes were up. Brady, meanwhile, was a U.S. representative, and therefore a much higher profile opponent. If Prophet blackmailed him into retreating, it would seem suspicious, perhaps even implicate him. Besides all of that, how he could always use an ally with such high political potential. One thing I would never doubt was Howie's persuasiveness to his cause. Eric Brady had a single 15-minute meeting with Prophet and walked away from Beam headquarters with a smile that exposed his deepest molars. Brady went on to retract every statement he had ever made regarding Beam and illegal or unconstitutional activity. He was branded a wishy-washy flip-flopper by the political media, and it took a solid week for Jackson and Charlie to convince me this was not a bogus, made-up, gibberish phrase. It was often said that when he eventually ran for a Senate seat, he lost due to his apparent indecisiveness, yet throughout the process of his own demise, Eric Brady was an unwavering friend and supporter of Beam. Whatever Prophet had promised him, it must have been immensely valuable. Next came Hodge. He was not in a position of immense power when he started to speak out against Beam. A wealthy, well-educated executive of a stock brokerage firm who spoke with such a subtle elegance, the tiniest twinge of arrogant confidence, but he made sense in the things that he said, and he refused to speak outside of his realm of expertise without data and facts to support it. It sometimes seemed as if he were in a crowd of people, nervously staring at their feet, and when he discovered he was the only one who was looking up and willing to call attention to the travesty of their condition, he also discovered the faintest bit of humor therein. Hodge always wore a calm smirk when he drew attention to the preposterousness of Beam. It was also obviously wrong when he spoke. For these reasons, combined with his almost tactile charisma, Hodge attained celebrity status faster than we had. His attack was so focused and precise, yet passionate and mass-appealing. Hodge expressed as a businessman his fear of allowing one corporation to hold an energy and technology monopoly. He forced people to consider how deeply they were willing to allow Beam to invade their personal privacy in exchange for security, going so far as to release all the information scouting had uncovered on him to demonstrate the length of their tendrils. Clifton Hodge told the story of Tyler Foon, illuminated to the public that he was caught before his infamous rampage, but twice was permitted to live when our sons and daughters were forced to die. Why? He told the story of my father, Dr. Kovorski, the engineer of nearly all of the most dangerous anomaly attacks in the early years of Beam, also alive, according to Beam's public records, while innocent people were killed, with no more justification than the potential to become exactly what Kovorski already was. Hodge had no skeletons in his closet, no lust for money or power, no hidden purpose or ulterior motives. All he wanted was to expose how inconsistent the most powerful organization in history was. Clifton Hodge simply wanted change, more specifically, Prophet's resignation. Hodge was assassinated on New Year's Day, 48 hours before the anniversary of Flyphone. An anomaly called Rick Fisher invaded his personal home that night and shot him. Fisher had, days before, submitted an application to Beam, wishing to join Ava, an occurrence that had grown so incredibly common it accounted for about half of our busts. Perhaps he thought we would be impressed. Maybe he saw this assassination of our strongest public opposition to date as an extra line to boost the strength of his resume. Or maybe somebody told him it was the first step of his interview process. If anybody asked me, I said that I did not know. But I did know that in my lifetime I had never been granted the right to choose which man I would follow. For years it was my father, now it was Prophet, with only a few months' worth of transitional free agency spent floating in an oversized jar. I like to think, were I ever fully granted the right to do so, Hodge was the sort of man I would choose to lead me. Perhaps my opinions of him were overinflated. Charlie maintained throughout his rise and fall that all he ever wanted was to usurp Howie's throne, thereby replacing Prophet with a more ambitious Prophet. But I believe Charlie's cynicism was only masking her disappointment, that yet another protest had sputtered out before it had gained significant enough traction to leave any lasting impression. At this rate, it seemed impossible that anyone would take down our prison. Maybe we would have to do it ourselves.
Why am I here? Honestly?
Charlie asked, sprawled sideways along the bench on the opposite side of the truck from me, her locks swaying in front of her face as she batted them listlessly every time they almost stopped. At her feet, hovering a foot above the bench, was Jackson Teague, diligently reading the evaluation report on Rick Fisher, which he should have already read days ago. Several sheets of paper were spread out in front of him, held hovering before his face telekinetically as he shifted from one to the next. Murphy, the head of the Equalizations Department, thus technically our boss, was driving the truck.
Did you read the report, Shade?
Murphy snapped over his shoulder.
Actually, yes, Murph, at least up to the PR 0.7 part. It was kind of hard to care after that, so I repeat the question. What the hell am I doing here if this guy's barely even an anomaly?
The potency rating system infrequently impacted how Ava handled its business, but was quite important for the other equalizers. In essence, a PR was an indication of how potentially threatening any bust would be on a scale from 0, formerly 1, to 10. 10 represented Charlie, while 0 would be a non-anomaly. The system was valuable as a quick one-off estimate, but was not without serious flaws. For example, conditional strength was not taken into account, or if it were, multiple PRs would be required for individual cases in different situations, which got messy. But more importantly than that, Charlie was a moving standard. While she always was considered a PR 10 for simplicity, she was significantly more powerful today than she was when the system was first implemented, leading to a dilution effect for the anomalies we busted. What once might have been considered a 4 was now well below a 1. And were we to round off to the nearest whole number, it would be difficult to justify the equalization of most anomalies when their PRs were no higher than a typical regular individual. Adding the decimal alleviated this issue, but it also led to situations like this one. A paltry 0.7 was almost too ridiculous to take seriously. His extracurricular activities ensured that I would do so anyway, but in some ways I would have preferred if evaluations just kept Rick Fisher at nothing.
Publicity, Charlie.
Murphy replied, dangerously glancing back at us and away from the road so we could see him roll his eyes.
What else is new? Cranston wants the whole gang here for a group picture after or some shit like that.
Seriously?
Charlie pressed the limits of her exasperation.
Now don't be a bunch of sourpusses over there, alright?
The excessively peppy melody of Peter Cranston, Beam's press secretary, reverberated through our earpieces from his office miles away in HQ. Over his first year and a half with the Bureau, Peter was a benign enough fellow from my perspective, just without parallel in the category of annoyances. He was afraid of me. I tended to have that effect on people when I met them face to face, being large, purple, ostensibly terrifying. It caused me dismay generally, but not specifically for Peter Cranston. I would accept him never truly getting to know me in exchange for never having to get to know him or talk to him.
Peter, who the fuck conference you in? This is a bust, asshole. Serious business.
Charlie hated him.
Now, Charlie, language, please. You know gosh darned well that I'm fully entitled to be in the loop on these things up to the point where the action starts and I become a distraction.
You are literally always a distraction.
Oh, Charlie.
He chuckled as if her temper were in good spirits.
You're always yanking my chain, aren't you?
Every night before I go to bed, I ask God to let you wake up with a lizard tail so that we can call you an anomaly and then I can kill you, Peter. Persistent homicidal thoughts, do those fall under chain yanking? What the hell does this bus have to do with you anyway?
Well, you never do know, do ya? Any moment could become a public moment. Gotta make sure the gang's got its best face on when the cameras start flashing. Gotta remind you to smile, pretty girl.
Charlie opened her mouth, probably to further inform Peter of her whims to murder him, this time more liberally laced with profanity, but my brother Phil interrupted.
Charlie, I actually am bound by Beam Protocol to conference him into every Ava bust he wants to be a part of. Last time I refused, the little baby asshole reported me to Prophet.
Now, there's really no need for name-calling, Philly.
I could not see Phil hovering a few thousand feet above us on the platform of his mobile lab, as was also new protocol for Ava bus in case a last-minute science consult was required, but I am quite certain I heard him snarl at the name Philly. It was often this disarming cheeriness that permitted Peter to talk when everyone wanted him to shut his mouth.
In any case, don't fret about it, okay, Charlie? I'll be out of your ear the second the first punch lands. Let you get all focused on the action the instant it begins, alrighty?
Jackson, without glancing away from the row of papers scrawled before his face, lightly slapped Charlie across the leg with the back of his hand.
You see that, Phil? First punch.
He said, boredly, glancing up at the cameras in the back of the truck and waving.
Now wait just the
Peter cut out, replaced by the sound of Charlie's triumphant giggles.
Thanks, JT.
Hey, Phil, could you get Charlie out too? She's in a real complaining mood today and I'm trying to read.
Bitch.
She kicked the papers floating before him, and they scattered into the air momentarily before snapping back to their original positions as if nothing had occurred.
Nice try.
He smirked, and she laughed out loud, then physically flung her body between him and the evaluation report, tugging on the corners of her mouth and sticking out her tongue to distract him as he craned his neck left and right to keep reading around her, with little success. This playful antagonism was typical of their relationship, and I beamed to myself as I quietly observed it escalate. Jackson rotated the papers above him and tipped his head back to read them against the ceiling of the truck, but Charlie in turn stood on the thighs of his crossed legs, blocking his view yet again with her taunting. She was perched somewhat precariously, and he reached to shove her off, but his hand passed right through the particulate dust that was her ungrouped shoulder. He slammed himself back down on the bench, attempting to bring her down with him, but her sixth sense allowed her to anticipate the motion, and she instead grouped back to her original position, lying next to him. For a moment, they just watched each other, waiting to see who would move next, until Charlie again kicked the papers out of the air. This time, he defeatedly let them float to the ground, as she cackled wickedly.
Don't mess with me, JT. I always win.
It was an accurate statement.
Besides, you don't need to read. Sid's just gonna handle this one anyway, right, buddy?
Naturally, I would not have it any other way, I confirmed. It had grown to the point with Ava where most busts did not require the joint effort of the three most powerful anomalies in the world. Typically, any one of us was sufficient, and since Jackson did not kill people and Charlie was prone to getting bored and adding personal achievement goals to busts to make them more interesting, I did most of the grunt work. It was an arrangement I was happy to partake in, and my closest friends appreciated me for the effort. But even if that were not our agreement, you would be hard-pressed to hold me from Hodges' killer. Charlie and Jackson both knew that much. As my teammates wished me luck, I stepped out of the back of the truck into the crisp morning air of the capital suburbs. A few kids playing on the sidewalk paused to excitedly whisper as I strode past, and I lifted my hand to their immense excitement. The media and paparazzi were thankfully not yet present. They tended to respect Beam's process while we were enthralled in it, saving their interactions for after the bust, essentially to avoid danger to themselves. More than anything else, this particular case did not promise to be much excitement anyway, at least not from a physical action perspective. Fisher had done the worst of his damage, and did not even possess the foresight to hide for it. He remained where he had always been, in his little ranch house on the cul-de-sac, waiting for us to come and shake his hand and offer him a position in exchange for his cold-blooded murder. But everyone knew Jackson was our friendly diplomat. Fisher would be in for quite a shock when he saw me on his porch. Suburb busts were always my least favorite. There was some unsettling aspect to disturbing the perfect family lifestyle contained therein. It was as if somehow city dwellers should have been accustomed to disruptions, while rural busts could typically be contained to the anomaly's own property, which made either of those settings more suited for our business. But for some reason I believed suburban middle-class families were more entitled to a little tranquility. Surely it was hogwash, faulty logic. Regardless, I felt bad. Maria Caraway, who had spent significant time as an evaluator before her relocation to the mountain branch of Beam, shared my sentiments about suburban anomalies, but for different reasons. Evaluations typically took place clandestinely. The limited living space in urban areas made it difficult for anomalies to hide things, and thus evaluations were simpler. Meanwhile, out in the country, it was easy for evaluators to set up long stakeouts in the surrounding nature without ever being spotted by the anomaly in question. But the suburbs were just large enough to conceal something, and just busy enough to make spying challenging. These evaluations typically took the longest and resulted in overstated PRs just to be safe rather than sorry. Everything was always just a bit fuzzier and more suspicious in the suburbs. Of course, none of this applied to Rick, the Fisher. As a volunteer to Beam's operations, his evaluation was carried out in a perfectly forthright manner. Interviews, demonstrations, a process pioneered by my own evaluation years ago. Furthermore, the greatest threat Fisher offered was his trademarked seismic stomp. Literally, he had this phrase trademarked, perhaps indicating the worst damage Fisher could do to anyone would be in the form of a litigation for copyright infringement. Phil, as head of research and technology, and the evaluator assigned to Fisher both assured within the report that his patented move generated by boots that released seismic waves when they struck the ground was no more impactful than the rumble of a large semi-truck driving down the freeway. Rick Fisher could shake the floor a little when he stamped his foot. It was not a description that held up to the caliber of anomaly I was accustomed to busting. But this was not for my amusement. This was for Clifton Hodge.
Just a second.
I could hear him through the door as I impatiently rang the bell a second time.
Hold your damn horses, I'm coming.
He persisted after the third. When I reached out for the fourth ring, the door creaked open and the angry face of Rick Fisher quickly flipped to stunned fear.
Cidney Kovorski?
Mr. Fisher, please come with me.
Aw, crap.
He groaned, backpedaling away from the door as I grasped the top of it and shoved it out of his hands, off the hinges. He nervously utilized his signature move, and the house rattled slightly under the minor vibration, but my pursuit did not slow down. Another stomp, slightly larger but no more persuasive. It was somewhat telling that my own attempt at a so-called seismic stomp, simply a regular stomp amplified by my enhanced musculature, had a much more profound effect, even going so far as to knock Fisher off of his feet. Perhaps we should not play games, Mr. Fisher, I said levelly. You know how this ends.
I've been played, Cidney.
He pleaded with me, using my first name as if we were long friends.
I'm a patsy. I'm a victim. You don't know the whole story, all right?
But I did. Rick Fisher was no more than a weapon and a scapegoat. I was not the one in this scenario with the wool over his eyes. We will sort it out at HQ, Mr. Fisher. Do not attempt to resist, and the process will be much more efficient for both of us. But he was not willing to go so quietly. The imbecile reached into the pocket of his pants and from within pulled a small black cylindrical device with a large red button atop. From my years of field experience, I knew big red buttons were notoriously and ubiquitously bad news, especially when, judging by his wide-eyed bewilderment and shivering fear, Fisher did not have any mental concept of what depressing this button would do, yet his thumb hovered above it, trying to determine if he was more afraid of me or whatever events the button would set into motion. Please, do not press that.
He told me if I got into trouble.
I knew to whom he was referring. You are a socially marginalized criminal on the verge of equalization. Thanks to his advice, has profit done nothing but lead you astray thus far? Make this easy, Fisher. The confused puppet glared at the device in his palm, licking his lips and rubbing the sweat off of his forehead. He finally looked back to me, smirking, and shrugged apologetically before plunging the scarlet mystery trigger, initiating some sort of cataclysmic disturbance outside of his house. Idiot, I flatly accused him.
Cidney, you better get out here, bud.
Phil informed me via the comm in my ear.
The cul-de-sac just, busted open a little bit and some kind of leviathan is rising out of it.
You are a dumb one. I gruffly snatched Fisher off the ground by the collar of his shirt, and he yelped as I slammed him into the nearest chair, pressing a foot firmly into his chest to secure him. I deprived him of his large mechanical boots to his babbling, incessant protesting. Once they were off, I hoisted him over my shoulder, rotated my arm cannon against my leg, and fired a shot of K-Pack at the boots on the ground. As they hissed and crackled, dissolving into thin air, Fisher wailed childishly at the loss of his prized possession, squirming like a rat to get out of my grasp. It was futile. The boots were beyond recovery, and my attention was already directed to whatever mess he had started outside. The awe I was struck with when I reached his front porch was sudden and incapacitating, but fleeting. It was not the first nor the largest destruction machine I had ever seen. Nonetheless, it was significantly more outstanding than anything I had expected going into this bust. 6 steel legs, each 5 feet thick in diameter, shot into the sky 25 feet before they hinged back downward, connecting in a spiral orientation to the slender silver bullet-shaped cockpit in the middle. It looked not unlike a massive metallic insect, stylistically a far cry from the clunky footwear I had destroyed moments ago. You built this? I asked the man on my shoulder sarcastically as I swung him back down to his feet.
Yeah.
He scarcely had the time or mental clarity to shrug through his unconvincing answer before a long iron tentacle shot out of the monolithic robot and latched itself around his trunk. I grasped at my prisoner, trying to secure him before the tentacle could drag him into the cockpit, but it was much faster than I was. Rick Fisher howled and screamed during the entirety of his journey from his own front porch to the command center of the robot he claimed to have built. Obviously, this was the first time he had even seen it. Further demonstrating that he was not the mastermind behind this sensational piece of equipment, Fisher did not have the foggiest idea how to operate the vehicle once he had been placed into its cockpit. The robot began blaring an ear-piercing siren as it clumsily stomped around in a circle. And as each massive column of a leg struck the ground and rattled the street, I recognized the comedy that he was far more efficient at producing his trademark seismic stomps in a vehicle not explicitly designed to do so, or even designed by himself. Once the mech began deploying artillery shells and bullets haphazardly about the cul-de-sac as it continued marching around itself, I resolved the situation probably warranted some backup. Truthfully, I could have still thwarted him solo, but it would be faster and cleaner with my partner's assistance. Perhaps a hand, my friends, I sighed into the telecom. Before they could reply, I marched up to the monster and wrapped myself around one of his legs. I had already successfully dislodged it from the central hub with a cacophonous clang and a shower of sparks by the time Charlie grouped into the fracas atop the machine and made her way to the opposite side so she could amputate the appendages with some amount of balance.
JT, get the projectiles.
She boredly commanded.
Yep, got him.
He was already doing so. Jackson had once explained to me that by far the simplest field of Jackson's, the force-mediating particles of his telekinesis, to generate was one in which he simply orbited an object around his own hovering body. It seemed to be the natural way that the particles wished to radiate from him, almost subconsciously and effortlessly, the trajectory on which manipulated things would go. And as such, whenever possible, this was the sort of field he would develop. Sure enough, there he was before us, floating 30 feet above the ground as mortar shells, missiles, and bullets of all calibers deflected off their set course toward him, psychically yanked into a rotating spiral around his body like the electrons of an atom or planets of a solar system. They moved too quickly to count bullet speed, after all, since slowing them down would require additional consideration. Yet even without a precise knowledge of the exact amount, it was an impressive display. Controlling multiple objects was always more taxing for Jackson, and in the days when I first met him, this feat would not be completable. Today it was so seemingly elementary, he was paying more attention to the action below him.
She's beating you, Sid, and you had a head start.
Charlie had already made fast work of 2 legs on her side of the monstrosity, grouping onto them and focusing for a few seconds before they vanished into dust like they were never there. I clutched onto the limb I had already removed from the behemoth, spreading my own legs to ensure I was braced enough to utilize it as a club, and swung it wildly through the second mechanical limb, knocking it toward an unsuspecting house on the cul-de-sac. It halted suddenly before the collision and flung up into Jackson's pull, joining the revolution dance of every piece of ammo Rick Fisher had fired thus far. Resting my hulking bat safely along the street, I sprung onto the back of the beast, saluting Jackson for his excellent heads-up catch, and strode along the body until I reached the joint of the third leg. I pressed the golden cuff around my wrist against the side of my thigh and briskly lifted it, spinning it in a circle with a loud crackle, extracting the corrosive K-pack from the port in my forearm and loading the chamber of my cannon. Aiming an open palm at the joint of the third leg, I swiveled my neck over my shoulder and made eye contact with Charlie, in a position on her leg, prepared to ungroup. We nodded to synchronize our amputations, then I clenched my fist, firing the purple liquid onto the connection between the leg and the body of Fisher's vehicle, severing it. Charlie simultaneously ungrouped her last leg, then herself grouped off of the body as I rode with it on its descent 20 feet to the street below. Once we were grounded and the machine powered down, I straddled the glass door of the cockpit and peered within it at Rick Fisher. A single bead of blood was dripping down the length of his face, and he opened and closed his mouth a few times at me, thunderstruck and defeated. I plunged my hand through the glass, unfastened his safety belt, snatched the fabric on the belly of his shirt, and plucked him out of the seat through the glass dome with a deafening shatter. He was instantly unconscious, but perhaps that was the only way Rick Fisher was willing to go down anyway. I hoped that our efforts were not some kind of fulfillment of his perverse wishes to play games, but if they were, at least we had made the game adequately short. I slid down the length of the dismantled megalith and rested Fisher in the truck.
Nice bust, Big Purple.
Charlie commended me as she grouped beside me. She patted me on the shoulder, and I smiled as we watched Jackson redirect his satellites of debris and projectiles up into space, where they would either harmlessly explode or drift away forever. I tried to ignore the flashing lights that were now fully assembled paparazzi, the adoring whistles and cheers from the crowd that had gathered to observe the show, the nagging insistence that this victory was no more than utterly symbolic in every way. Hodge's killer was still at large, but we could not bust our prophet. Yes, it was a bit more action than I anticipated seeing today, but nothing for the mighty triumvirate, right? I kissed the top of her head and wrapped my arm around her shoulder. Charlie was not an affectionate type, and had a general rule against such displays. I was a lucky exception.
Hey, come on!
Jackson exclaimed as he landed.
City's passing out head kisses and I miss it because you two can't help clean up the mess? That hardly seems fair.
Ha! I guffawed. Here you are, brother. And I emphatically kissed him on the mouth. When I pulled away, with Charlie snickering wildly in the background, Jackson's face was puckered and contorted, one eye shut.
Thanks, bud. Did we ever figure out why you're so sour?
From my perspective, you are rather bitter, Jackson.
Well, I'm not exactly a necessary part of you two figuring out the flavor of each other's saliva, so I think I'll go play my old favorite game of ungroup the paparazzi's cameras.
And she disappeared to do just that, famously against our rampant popularity.
Anyway, nice work, everyone. Murph, Phil, good bust. And especially you, Sid.
Jackson patted me on the back and we chuckled at the idiots attempting to run from a ubiquitous shadow, watching her pop up next to unsuspecting moron after unsuspecting moron to turn his photography paraphernalia into invisible dust as she giggled maniacally.
Sorry we had to get in on it, though.
I do not understand your remorse, Jackson. I am grateful for the assistance.
Right, but, well, Charlie and I wanted to let you have this one. Hodge was your guy, or whatever. We know you wanted it by yourself.
I smiled, sadly. Yes, but then these days I am quite accustomed to not getting what I want. He returned my sad smile, one of the two people in the universe who truly understood what I meant. The other was terrorizing freelance photographers, in a sense, probably just to forget it.
Thank you for listening to the Beam Chronicles, a fiction podcast written and produced by me, MJ Dooney. Been a while. I have not made a new episode in 7 months. I think the last time I said I'd be starting book 2 in May, which was a little while ago, so sorry, first of all, if you were looking for it this summer. There's a variety of reasons I wasn't doing it: mental health, life stuff, excuses, mostly just excuses, honestly, but I decided I was just gonna start it up again. Incidentally, there's a 2-year time skip between the end of the first book and the start of the second one, which you know that now, but at least I didn't try to match the time skip. I think I'll be back to a weekly schedule, at least for the time being, so look for new episodes on Mondays. One thing that was really keeping me from getting new episodes out was that I wanted to do a really big recap of book 1, sort of like a supercut of all the best moments to remind you of what actually happened. I started doing that like 4 different ways. None of them felt particularly authentic or interesting, and it became another barrier to me getting started, so I'm just not gonna do it. Or maybe I will in a few months if it feels necessary. For now, I need to just start creating something again that I'm proud of. As always, I'm in this for the love of the game because I'm a storyteller. I'm sort of talking to myself right now, but if you're still listening and you need some motivation to do that thing you wanted to do, go do it. It always feels better when you just go do it. As always, you can email me, beamchronicles@gmail.com, to say hi or whatever. Encouragement, feedback, always welcome. If you have any interest in drawing something for money, I want to talk to you. Socials are not active at all, but you can follow me anyway on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. All music and sound effects were sourced from the Epidemic Sound Library. Special thanks to Sergio Duarte for creating the cover art for this podcast. Cidney looks great. There should be new ones coming for the other 2 characters in the next few months. Thanks again for listening.